The autumn of 1932, in the mountains of North Carolina, brought with it a chill that seemed to seep into men's souls as easily as it did their bones. It was the kind of season that tested a person's resolve, separating those who would endure from those who would surrender to the harsh realities of the Great Depression. In those unforgiving hills where ancient Cherokee paths wound between towering oaks, and the mist clung to valleys like forgotten memories, a giant of a man named Tobias "Tank" Morrison had carved out a reputation that made even the bravest souls cross to the other side of the road when they saw him coming. At 7 feet and 2 inches tall, with shoulders that could block out the sun and fists that had ended more fights than anyone cared to count, Tank Morrison was a force of nature wrapped in human flesh. His very presence could silence a crowded room, could make grown men stammer and children hide behind their mothers' skirts. But what no one in the mountain communities of western North Carolina could have predicted was that 4 Cherokee sisters, none of them taller than 5 feet, would be the ones to bring this giant to his knees. This is the story of how the smallest among us can possess the greatest power, how kindness can topple what violence never could, and how sometimes the most feared man in 3 counties needs nothing more than to remember what it feels like to be human. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first time anyone in Asheville heard the name Tobias Morrison, it was whispered in the emergency ward of Mission Hospital on a rain-soaked Thursday evening in September 1932. 3 men had been brought in with injuries that defied easy explanation. Broken ribs, fractured jaws, and the kind of trauma that spoke of an encounter with something far beyond ordinary human strength. "What in God's name did this to you boys?" Dr. William Carter had asked as he examined the damage, his experienced hands cataloging wounds that suggested their attacker possessed the power of a freight train. The youngest of the 3, a scrawny mill worker named Pete Jenkins, had managed to speak through his swollen lips. It was Tank Morrison, Doc, all 7 feet of him. "We was just having some drinks at Murphy's Tavern, talking about work and such, when this giant walks in like he owns the place." Pete paused, wincing as Dr. Carter probed a particularly tender spot on his ribs. "We wasn't bothering nobody, just minding our own business. But Tank, he takes exception to something Jimmy here said about the Cherokee folks working the lumber camps. Says we don't know what we're talking about." The second man, Jimmy Walsh, tried to nod but thought better of it when pain shot through his neck. "I just said what everyone knows about them people taking jobs from honest white folks. Wasn't nothing personal against them, just stating facts. But Tank, he gets this look in his eyes like he's about to murder someone." Dr. Carter had seen his share of barroom brawl injuries over his 20 years of practice, but nothing quite like this. The precision of the damage suggested not wild, drunken violence, but controlled, methodical application of overwhelming force. "So he attacked you for expressing an opinion." "Attack?" The third man, Bobby Hawkins, let out a bitter laugh that ended in a cough. "Doc, this wasn't no attack. This was more like a natural disaster. Tank didn't even seem angry, really. He just stood up real slow-like, walked over to our table, and told us we had 30 seconds to apologize for what we'd said and promise never to say it again." Pete picked up the story, his voice growing quieter as he relived the encounter. When Jimmy told him to mind his own business, Tank just nodded like he'd expected that answer. Then he picked Jimmy up by the front of his shirt with one hand like he was lifting a child and threw him clear across the room into the bar. The sound Jimmy made when he hit was like a sack of grain dropping from a wagon. Dr. Carter paused in his examination, struck by something in Pete's tone. "You sound almost respectful when you talk about him." "Respectful?" Bobby considered this. "I suppose that's one word for it. The thing is, Doc, Tank could have killed all 3 of us without breaking a sweat. Hell, he could have killed everyone in that tavern if he'd wanted to. but he didn't. He just made his point real clear, like, paid for the damage to Murphy's bar, and walked out like nothing had happened. The story that emerged over the following weeks painted a picture of a man who had become something of a legend in the mountain community surrounding Asheville. Tobias Morrison had appeared in the area sometime during the previous winter, a giant of a man with no visible past and no apparent ties to anyone or anything. He worked sporadically, taking jobs that required raw physical strength, logging, construction, anything that could make use of his extraordinary size and power. But it wasn't his size alone that made Tank Morrison a figure of legend and fear. It was the stories that followed him like shadows, tales of interventions that seemed to follow a pattern that no one quite understood, but everyone had learned to respect. There was the incident at the company store in Black Mountain, where Tank had quietly appeared behind a group of men who were harassing the Cherokee woman who cleaned the store after hours. The men had been making increasingly crude comments about what they thought she might be willing to do for extra money, cornering her between the shelves while her teenage daughter waited outside. Tank hadn't said a word. He had simply placed one massive hand on the shoulder of the ringleader, a shift supervisor named Carl Brennan, who was known for his nasty temper and his belief that his position gave him the right to treat others however he pleased. The pressure of that hand had been enough to bring Brennan to his knees, and the sight of the giant's face had been enough to send the other men scrambling for the door. "I don't ever want to see you bothering Mrs. Standing Bear again," Tank had said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made argument impossible. "In fact, I don't want to see you treating any woman with anything less than the respect you'd show your own mother. Are we clear on that, Carl?" Brennan had nodded frantically, and from that day forward, his behavior toward the Cherokee workers and their families had been a model of politeness. More importantly, word had spread through the community that Tank Morrison had appointed himself some kind of unofficial protector of people who couldn't protect themselves. The pattern became clear to those who paid attention. Tank Morrison didn't look for trouble, didn't start fights for the sake of fighting. But when he witnessed injustice, when he saw the strong preying on the weak, he intervened with a combination of overwhelming physical presence and carefully measured violence that left no doubt about the consequences of continuing such behavior. Cherokee community, in particular, seemed to fall under Tank's unofficial protection. During an era when tensions between white settlers and Native Americans ran high, when economic desperation made scapegoating easy, Tank Morrison had somehow become a one-man peacekeeping force. But who was he really? Where had he come from, and what drove a man of his size and obvious capability to involve himself in the troubles of people who were complete strangers to him? The answer to those questions lay buried in Tank's past, in a history he shared with no one and memories that haunted his sleep. Those who looked closely might have noticed the carefully controlled way he moved, as if he were constantly aware of his own potential for destruction. They might have seen the way his eyes tracked movement in a room, cataloging threats and exits with the instincts of someone who had learned to expect violence. What they couldn't see were the nightmares that woke him most nights, dreams filled with the sounds of artillery and the screams of dying men. They couldn't know about the battlefield in France where Sergeant Tobias Morrison had earned a chest full of medals and a heart full of guilt that threatened to crush him more thoroughly than any enemy shell. Tank had returned from the Great War, a changed man, his extraordinary size now married to combat skills that made him a walking weapon. He had tried to settle back into civilian life, had attempted to find work that didn't require him to hurt people. But everywhere he went, his reputation preceded him. Employers saw only his size and assumed he was good for nothing but intimidation and violence. Fellow workers feared him, women avoided him, and children ran from him. So he had taken to the road, drifting from place to place, taking whatever work he could find and trying to outrun the memories that followed him like faithful dogs. He had told himself that isolation was safer for everyone, that a man like him was better off alone, but the mountains of North Carolina had somehow felt different. Maybe it was the Cherokee community scattered through the hills, people who understood what it meant to be displaced, to carry the weight of a history that others couldn't comprehend. Maybe it was simply that he had grown tired of running. Whatever the reason, Tank Morrison had found himself settling into the area around Asheville, taking a job with a logging outfit that operated in the remote valleys where the Cherokee had managed to maintain some of their traditional lands. The work was hard and dangerous, requiring the kind of physical strength that Tank possessed in abundance. More importantly, it was work that allowed him to be useful without having to hurt anyone. The Cherokee workers at the logging camp had been wary of him at first, as they were of all white men who appeared in their territory. But Tank's actions spoke louder than his intimidating presence. He worked twice as hard as anyone else, never complained about the conditions, and treated everyone with the kind of respectful distance that suggested he understood he was a guest. In their land. It was during his third month at the logging camp that Tank first heard about the Walker sisters. The conversation had taken place around the evening fire, where the men gathered after 14-hour days of cutting timber and hauling logs down treacherous mountain paths. Joseph Standing Bear, the Cherokee foreman who had initially been skeptical of Tank's presence, was telling a story about his grandmother's generation, about the families who had managed to avoid the Trail of Tears by hiding deep in the mountain wilderness. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the old days," Joseph said, his weathered hands carving a piece of wood as he spoke, "about the families who went so deep into the mountains that the soldiers never found them. They lived like their ancestors for decades, keeping the old ways alive while the world changed around them." One of the younger workers, a man named Thomas Crow Feather, looked up from sharpening his axe. "My mother knew some of those families," sighed. "There was one group of sisters who lived way up in the high country, maybe 15 miles from here as the crow flies. Never came down to trade, never had anything to do with the outside world. The Walker sisters," Joseph nodded. "Though that's not their Cherokee name. They took white names when they had to register for the government papers, but they never stopped being Cherokee in their hearts." Tank found himself listening more intently than usual. There was something in the way the men spoke about these sisters, a combination of respect and concern, that suggested their story was more complex than simple isolation. "They still up there?" Tank asked, surprising everyone with his participation in the conversation. He rarely spoke during these evening gatherings, preferring to listen to the rhythm of voices that reminded him of better times. Joseph looked at him thoughtfully before answering. "Far as anyone knows. But it's been years since anyone's seen them. Could be they moved on, could be." He left the sentence unfinished, but the implication was clear. Thomas Crow Feather set down his axe and stared into the fire. "My cousin went up that way hunting last spring. Said he found signs of habitation, but no people. Smoke from a chimney, vegetable garden that looked tended, but when he called out, nobody answered." "Maybe they just don't trust outsiders," suggested another worker. "Maybe," Joseph agreed. "Or maybe they need help but are too proud to ask for it. The old ways don't always prepare people for the modern world, especially when that world doesn't want them to exist." Tank absorbed this information in silence, but something about the story stayed with him. That night, as he lay in his bunk listening to the sounds of the forest, he found himself thinking about 4 Cherokee sisters living in isolation, possibly struggling to survive in a world that had grown increasingly hostile to their existence. He told himself it was none of his business. He had learned the hard way that getting involved in other people's problems usually led to complications he was better off avoiding. But sleep eluded him, and when morning came, Tank Morrison found himself making a decision that would change not only his life, but the lives of 4 women who had spent decades believing that the world had nothing left to offer them. The decision to seek out the Walker sisters wasn't one Tank made lightly. He spent several days considering the implications, weighing his desire to help against his long-standing policy of avoiding unnecessary complications. But something Joseph standing there had said kept echoing in his mind. The old ways don't always prepare people for the modern world, especially when that world doesn't want them to exist. Tank knew something about being unwanted in the modern world. He understood what it felt like to be seen as a relic from an earlier, more violent time. If there were 4 women struggling to survive in the wilderness because they couldn't find a place in a society that had no use for them, then maybe he could at least make sure they were safe. On a crisp October morning, Tank asked Joseph standing bare for directions to the high country where the Walker sisters were believed to live. Joseph studied him for a long moment before responding. "It's rough country up there, Tank. No real trails, just game paths and Cherokee routes that haven't been used in decades. You sure you want to make that climb just to check on some women who might not even be there anymore?" Tank shouldered his pack, which contained basic supplies and some of the preserved food the logging camp provided to workers. Someone should check. If they're up there and they need help, they should know they're not completely alone. Joseph nodded slowly, recognizing something in Tank's expression that suggested this wasn't really a request for permission. "Follow the ridgeline north for about 8 miles. When you come to a place where 3 streams meet, take the middle path up toward the peak. There's supposed to be a cabin about 2 miles up from there, hidden in a stand of old-growth pine." "Supposed to be?" "Nobody's actually been up there in years, Tank. Could be nothing left but ruins." As Tank set out on the trek into the high country, he reflected on how different his life had become since arriving in North Carolina. For the first time since returning from France, he felt like he was moving towards something positive, rather than simply running away from his past. The climb was challenging even for someone of Tank's physical capabilities. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as he gained elevation, forcing him to navigate around deadfalls and rocky outcroppings that would have stopped a less determined traveler. But the solitude felt good, reminding him of the peaceful moments between battles when he could almost forget about the war. It was late afternoon when Tank finally reached the area Joseph had described. The convergence of 3 streams created a natural clearing in the dense forest, and Tank could see evidence of old trails leading up toward the higher elevations. But there was something else he noticed as well: fresh footprints in the soft earth beside the largest stream. Small footprints, clearly made by someone wearing what looked like traditional Cherokee moccasins. Tank studied the tracks carefully, noting that they appeared to have been made within the last day or 2. Someone was definitely living up in this wilderness, and they had been down to the stream recently. Following the middle path as Joseph had instructed, Tank began the final climb toward the hidden cabin. The trail was barely visible, overgrown with years of disuse, but Tank's military training had taught him to read terrain and follow subtle signs that others might miss. As he climbed higher, Tank began to smell wood smoke, faint but unmistakable. Someone was indeed living up here, and they had a fire going. The realization made him more careful about his approach. 4 women living in isolation would naturally be suspicious of any stranger, especially a giant white man appearing unexpectedly in their territory. It was the sound that stopped him first, echoing through the pine trees like music from another world. Someone was singing a Cherokee song that Tank didn't understand, but that seemed to carry the weight of generations. The voice was clear and strong, rising and falling with the ancient rhythms that spoke of connection to the land and the ancestors. Tank paused behind a large pine tree, suddenly uncertain about his decision to come here. What right did he have to intrude on these women's solitude? They had clearly chosen isolation for a reason, and his presence might be seen as an invasion rather than an offer of help. But as he stood there listening to the song, Tank realized that he had come too far to turn back now. Whatever the Walker sisters' reaction to his appearance, They deserved to know that there were people in the outside world who cared about their welfare. Taking a deep breath, Tank stepped out from behind the tree and into a clearing that would forever change his understanding of what it meant to be strong. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The clearing Tank stepped into defied every expectation he had formed during his climb through the wilderness. Instead of the primitive shelter he had imagined, he found himself looking at a homestead that seemed to exist in perfect harmony with the surrounding forest. A substantial log cabin sat nestled among towering pines, its chimney releasing the smoke he had detected earlier. Gardens sprawled in carefully planned terraces, taking advantage of every patch of sunlight that penetrated the canopy. Root cellars, smoking sheds, and other outbuildings spoke of a completely self-sufficient operation that had been decades in the making. But it was the four women who emerged from various parts of the homestead that truly captured Tank's attention. They moved with the fluid grace of people who belonged completely to their environment, appearing so suddenly and silently that Tank realized they had been aware of his presence long before he had spotted their clearing. The eldest appeared to be in her 50s, with silver threading through her long black hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of honest work. She carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone accustomed to leadership, and Tank instinctively recognized her as the matriarch of this unusual family. The second sister looked to be in her late 40s, slightly taller than the eldest, but with the same intelligent dark eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of Tank's appearance and demeanor. She held a gathering basket filled with medicinal herbs, and Tank noticed that her movement suggested someone with extensive knowledge of the forest and its resources. The third sister was probably in her early 40s, and Tank was struck by the way she positioned herself with clear sight lines to both him and her sisters. There was something about her posture that reminded him of soldiers he had known, people who had learned to assess threats and plan responses with military precision. The youngest sister couldn't have been more than 35, and despite being the smallest of the four, there was an energy about her that seemed to fill the entire clearing. She carried a bow that looked both well-maintained and frequently used, and Tank suspected she was responsible for much of the family's hunting. For a long moment, nobody spoke. Tank stood at the edge of the clearing, acutely aware that his 7-foot frame made him look like some kind of giant invader in this peaceful sanctuary. The sisters regarded him with the patient wariness of deer evaluating a potential predator, ready to disappear into the forest at the first sign of genuine threat. It was the eldest sister who finally broke the silence, speaking in English but with the musical intonation that marked Cherokee as her first language. "You are far from any trail, giant man. What brings you to our mountain?" Tank removed his hat, a gesture of respect he hoped would be understood across cultural boundaries. "My name is Tobias Morrison, ma'am. I work at the logging camp down in the valley. Some of the Cherokee men there mentioned that you ladies lived up here, and they were concerned that you might need assistance with anything." The second sister stepped forward slightly, her herb basket still clutched in capable hands. "Assistance with what, exactly?" "We have managed our affairs quite well for many years, without help from the outside world." There was no hostility in her voice, but Tank detected a note of suspicion that was entirely reasonable given the circumstances. A giant white man appearing unexpectedly in their territory would naturally raise questions about his motives. "I'm sure you have," Tank replied carefully. "From what I can see, you've built something remarkable up here. I suppose I just wanted to make sure you knew there were people down in the valley who would be willing to help if you ever needed anything." The third sister, the one who reminded Tank of a soldier, spoke for the first time. "People in the valley? You mean the same people who would prefer that Cherokee families simply disappear entirely?" Tank winced at the directness of the question, recognizing the truth it contained. Some of them, yes, but not all. The men I work with respect you and your way of life. They wanted to make sure you were safe." The youngest sister laughed, a sound like water over stones. "Safe? Look around you, giant man. Do we appear to be in danger?" Tank did look around, taking in the evidence of the sisters' competence and self-sufficiency. Gardens that were clearly producing abundant food, structures that had been built to last, tools and equipment that spoke of careful maintenance and practical skill. These women had created a thriving homestead in some of the most challenging terrain in North Carolina. "No," he admitted. "You clearly don't need protection from the wilderness. But the world down below has a way of encroaching on places like this, whether people want it to or not." The eldest sister studied Tank with eyes that seemed to see far, more than his physical appearance. "You speak like someone who understands something about unwanted encroachment, Tobias Morrison. What is your story?" Tank hesitated, realizing that these women had somehow turned his welfare check on them into an examination of his own circumstances. "I was a soldier in the Great War. When I came back, I found that people looked at me and saw only my size, only what they assumed I was capable of. So I've been moving around, looking for a place where I could be useful without being seen as a threat." The second sister set down her herb basket and regarded Tank with new interest. "And have you found such a place?" "Maybe. The logging camp has been good work. The Cherokee men there judge me by my actions rather than my appearance. But I'm still trying to figure out where I belong in a world that doesn't seem to have much use for people like me." The youngest sister lowered her bow, a gesture that Tank interpreted as a positive sign. "People like you? What kind of person do you think you are, giant man?" Tank was quiet for a moment, considering how to answer a question that went to the heart of his struggle since returning from France. "Someone who is trained to hurt people, but who wants to protect them instead. Someone who looks like a monster, but who's trying to figure out how to be human." The silence that followed was different from the wary quiet of their initial encounter. Tank sensed that his honesty had shifted something in the sister's perception of him. Though he couldn't be sure in which direction. It was the eldest sister who spoke first, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there before. "My name is Margaret Walker, though my Cherokee name is Awanita, which means fawn. These are my sisters." She gestured to each woman in turn. "This is Elizabeth, or Adzila, meaning blossom. Our third sister is Catherine, whose Cherokee name is Galilei, meaning attractive, and our youngest is Sarah, who we call Ayana, meaning eternal blossom." Tank nodded to each sister as she was introduced, committing their names to memory and feeling honored that they had chosen to share both their English and Cherokee identities with him. "We appreciate your concern for our welfare, Tobias Morrison," Margaret continued. "But as you can see, we have managed to create a life here that serves our needs quite well." Elizabeth stepped forward, her herb basket forgotten as she studied Tank with the intensity of someone trying to solve a puzzle. "But you didn't climb 15 miles of mountain wilderness just to deliver greetings from the logging camp. What did you really come here to find?" Tank realized that these women possessed the kind of insight that came from decades of reading people and situations with survival-level accuracy. They had somehow perceived that his journey to their mountain was motivated by something deeper than simple neighborly concern. "I suppose," Tank said slowly, "I came here because I heard about 4 Cherokee sisters who had managed to maintain their traditional way of life, despite everything the modern world had thrown at them. And I wanted to see if that was really possible. If there was still a place in this world for people who didn't fit into the conventional categories." Catherine, the sister who reminded Tank of a soldier, smiled for the first time since his arrival. "You wanted to see if we had found a way to be Cherokee in a world that wishes we didn't exist. Something like that, yes." Sarah, the youngest, began to laugh again, but this time there was genuine warmth in the sound. "Well, giant man, you've found us. 4 Cherokee sisters who grow our own food, make our own medicines, build our own shelters, and answer to no one but ourselves and the Creator. Is that what you were hoping to discover? Tank looked around the clearing again, seeing it now through different eyes. This wasn't just a homestead. It was a statement of independence, a declaration that it was possible to live according to traditional values even in an increasingly modern world. It's more than I hoped to discover, Tank said honestly. It's proof that people can choose their own path, even when society tries to tell them they don't have that option. Margaret Walker studied Tank for a long moment, and he had the distinct impression that she was making some kind of decision about him. Tobias Morrison, you have climbed far to reach us, and you have spoken honestly about your purpose. Cherokee tradition requires that we offer hospitality to travelers who come to us with good intentions. Would you accept our invitation to share our evening meal? Tank felt a surge of gratitude that was almost overwhelming. These women were offering him something he hadn't experienced in years, simple human acceptance without judgment or fear. I would be honored, Mrs. Walker. As the sisters began preparing for the evening meal, Tank found himself assigned various tasks that made use of his size and strength. Sarah directed him to split firewood while Elizabeth gathered additional vegetables from the gardens. Catherine disappeared into the forest, returning with fresh game that would supplement their dinner. Margaret began preparing what Tank would later learn was traditional Cherokee bread, working with ingredients that had been grown, gathered, and processed entirely within their mountain sanctuary. During the meal preparation, Tank began to understand the remarkable system the sisters had developed over their decades of isolation. Each woman had specialized skills that complemented the others perfectly. Margaret was clearly the leader and the keeper of traditional knowledge, able to prepare foods and medicines according to recipes that had been passed down through generations. Of Cherokee women, Elizabeth possessed an encyclopedic knowledge of the mountain's plant life, able to identify, gather, and process dozens of species for food, medicine, and practical use. Her herb basket had contained remedies for everything from headaches to serious infections, all derived from plants that grew within walking distance of their cabin. Catherine was the engineer and strategist of the group, responsible for maintaining their buildings, planning their seasonal activities, and ensuring their security. Tank noticed that she kept track of his movements with the unconscious vigilance of someone who had learned never to let her guard down completely. Sarah was clearly the hunter and scout, responsible for providing game and for monitoring the approaches to their territory. Her bow was a work of art, crafted with techniques that Tank suspected had been unchanged for centuries. As they shared the meal around a fire that had been built in a stone circle that showed signs of decades of use, Tank found himself part of a conversation unlike any he had experienced since returning from the war. The sisters spoke of their mountain with the kind of intimate knowledge that came from a lifetime of careful observation. They discussed the behavior of animals, the patterns of weather, the subtle signs that indicated changes in the forest's health, but they also spoke of the outside world with a sophisticated understanding that surprised Tank. These women had chosen isolation, but they weren't ignorant of current events or social changes. They knew about the economic depression affecting the country, understood the political pressures facing Cherokee communities, and had made informed decisions about how much contact they wanted with the broader society. We are not hiding from the world, Tobias Morrison, Margaret explained as they shared the simple but delicious meal. We are living according to our own choices rather than accepting the limited options that world offers to Cherokee women. Elizabeth nodded in agreement. Down in the valleys, Cherokee families are struggling to maintain their identity while adapting to white society's demands. They must choose between traditional ways and economic survival. We chose to create a third option. Tank was beginning to understand that his journey to this mountain had brought him into contact with something extraordinary. These four sisters had accomplished what he had been searching for since returning from France. They had found a way to be themselves completely, without compromise or apology. But as the evening progressed and the conversation deepened, Tank began to sense that beneath the sisters' remarkable competence and self-sufficiency lay challenges that even their combined skills might not be able to overcome. The modern world had a way of intruding on even the most remote sanctuaries, and Tank suspected that the Walker sisters' paradise might be more fragile than it appeared. It was Catherine who finally broached the subject that Tank had been sensing throughout the evening. "Tobias Morrison, you said that the world below has a way of encroaching on places like this. What exactly do you know about such encroachment?" Tank set down his cup of pine needle tea and considered how much he should reveal about the conversations he had overheard at the logging camp and in the towns below. "There's talk," he said carefully, "about government surveys in this area. Something about mineral rights and timber assessments. I don't know all the details, but there are people in suits asking questions about land ownership in the high country." The silence that followed his words was heavy with implications that Tank didn't fully understand, but that clearly meant something significant to the sisters. It was Sarah who finally spoke, her voice carrying a note of resignation that seemed entirely at odds with her earlier energy. "So they finally found us." Sarah's words hung in the night air like a death sentence, and Tank watched as the four sisters exchanged glances that spoke of shared knowledge and carefully guarded secrets. The warmth of the evening meal suddenly felt fragile, threatened by implications that Tank was only beginning to understand. Margaret Walker set down her cup with deliberate care, her weathered hand steady despite what Tank recognized as profound concern. "Sarah speaks of something we had hoped might never come to pass, but which we have been preparing for since we first came to this mountain." "Preparing how?" Tank asked, though he suspected the answer would reveal depths to these women that went far beyond their already impressive self-sufficiency. It was Catherine who answered, her soldier's bearing becoming more pronounced as she shifted into what Tank realized was a defensive mindset. "Tobias Morrison, what do you know about Cherokee history? The real history, not the sanitized version they teach in white schools." Tank considered the question carefully. His education had been limited, and his knowledge of Cherokee history came primarily from conversations with the men at the logging camp. "I know about the Trail of Tears, about the forced removals in the 1830s. I know that some families managed to avoid the deportations by hiding in the mountains." Elizabeth leaned forward, her herb-stained fingers tracing patterns in the dirt beside the fire. "What you may not know is that the families who stayed behind did so at enormous cost. They gave up their legal existence, their rights to own property, their access to schools and medical care. They became invisible people in their own homeland. Our grandmother was one of those invisible people," Margaret continued, her voice carrying the weight of generational memory. "She was 12 years old when the soldiers came. Her family was supposed to march west with the others, but her father made a different choice. He took his wife and daughter deep into these mountains, to places where white men had never set foot." Tank was beginning to understand that he had stumbled into something far more complex than a simple homestead. "Your grandmother lived her entire life in hiding?" Sarah nodded, her bow now resting across her knees like a reminder of constant vigilance. "She lived, she married another invisible Cherokee man, and she raised her children to be invisible too. Our mother was born on this mountain, lived her whole life here, and died here without ever having legal recognition of her existence. And you four have continued that tradition," Tank said, pieces of the puzzle beginning to fall into place. "You're not just living a traditional lifestyle. You're living outside the legal system entirely." Catherine's smile was grim. "Exactly. No birth certificates, no property deeds, no government records of any kind. As far as the outside world is concerned, the Walker sisters don't exist." Tank felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. "Which means you have no legal claim to this land." "None whatsoever," Margaret confirmed. "We are squatters on what was once Cherokee territory, but which the government now considers public land available for survey and potential sale to private interests. The implications were staggering. These women had spent decades building a life that could be swept away by a simple government decision. All their improvements, all their careful cultivation of the land, all their deep knowledge of this particular ecosystem meant nothing in legal terms. But surely there must be some protection, Tank said, struggling to comprehend the precariousness of their situation. After all this time, after all the work you've put into this place, ... Elizabeth shook her head sadly. Protection comes from legal recognition, and legal recognition comes from participating in systems that our grandmother chose to reject. When she decided to remain invisible, she made that choice not just for herself, but for all her descendants. Tank was quiet for a long moment, absorbing the magnitude of what the sisters had shared with him. They weren't just living a traditional lifestyle. They were maintaining a form of resistance that had persisted for over a century. But that resistance had come at the cost of any legal security or protection. The government surveys you mentioned, Catherine said, bringing the conversation back to the immediate threat. They're not just routine assessments. There's talk of this area being developed for mineral extraction or timber harvesting on an industrial scale. How do you know that? Tank asked. Sarah smiled, but there was no humor in the expression. Because we're not nearly as isolated as we might appear. We have ways of learning about things that might affect us. Margaret rose from her place by the fire and disappeared into the cabin, returning with what Tank initially thought was a photograph. But as she handed it to him, he realized it was actually a detailed hand-drawn map showing the mountain region and the surrounding valleys. Our network of information includes Cherokee families throughout these mountains, Margaret explained as Tank studied the map. Families who chose to integrate with white society, but who remember their origins and maintain connections to those of us who chose differently. Tank could see that the map marked not just geographical features, but also the locations of Cherokee families, both integrated and hidden. There were symbols indicating safe houses, sources of supplies, and routes for emergency evacuation. It was, he realized, the infrastructure for a resistance movement that had been operating for generations. This is remarkable, Tank said, understanding now why the sisters have been so careful about revealing their existence to him. You're part of something much larger than just your individual homestead. Elizabeth nodded. What we've built here is one node in a network that spans these mountains. We've maintained Cherokee culture, Cherokee knowledge, and Cherokee independence in ways that integration would have made impossible. Catherine pointed to several locations on the map that Tank could see were marked with recent notations. But that network is under threat. Government surveys have been conducted at 3 of these locations in the past month. Families have been told they need to produce property deeds or face eviction. And since invisible people don't have property deeds, Sarah added grimly, eviction becomes inevitable. Tank studied the faces around the fire, seeing now the weight these women carried. They weren't just responsible for their own survival. They were part of a hidden community that was facing systematic destruction. What are you going to do? He asked. Margaret was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire as if seeking guidance from ancestors who had faced similar impossible choices. That depends on whether we choose to remain invisible or to step into the light and fight for our right to exist. What does that mean exactly? Catherine leaned forward, her strategic mind clearly engaged with possibilities and consequences. It means deciding whether to continue hiding and hope the surveys pass us by, or to emerge from invisibility and claim legal recognition of our presence here. But didn't you say that legal recognition would mean giving up the traditional lifestyle? That's been your family's choice for generations? Elizabeth nodded slowly. That's the impossible choice we're facing. Remain true to our grandmother's path and risk losing everything, or compromise our principles in hopes of saving what we can. Tank was beginning to understand why his arrival At the Sisters Mountain had been met with such careful evaluation. He wasn't just a curious visitor. He was a potential ally at a moment when allies might be desperately needed. "Is there a third option?" Tank asked. "Some way to protect what you've built without completely abandoning your principles?" Sarah looked at him with new interest. "What are you thinking, giant man?" Tank hesitated, aware that what he was about to suggest would fundamentally change his own life as much as it might affect the sisters' situation. "I was thinking that legal recognition doesn't have to come from the people who have lived here. It could come from someone who chooses to make this place his legal residence and then invites the sisters to remain as guests." The silence that followed was profound, and Tank could see the sisters processing the implications of his suggestion with the careful deliberation of people who had learned never to make hasty decisions. Margaret spoke first, her voice careful and measured. "You're suggesting that you would claim legal residence here and then protect our right to remain." "I'm suggesting that a white man with legal standing might be able to do things that invisible Cherokee women cannot," Tank replied. "I could file a homestead claim, establish legal residence, and then ensure that the traditional caretakers of this land are recognized and protected." Catherine's soldier mind was clearly analyzing the tactical advantages and risks of such an arrangement. "It would require you to abandon your job at the logging camp and commit to living here permanently. It would also require us to trust you completely," Elizabeth added. "To put our family's survival in the hands of someone we met only today." Sarah's question was the most direct. "Why would you do such a thing for people you barely know?" Tank looked around the fire at four women who had somehow managed to maintain their dignity, their culture, and their independence against overwhelming odds. In their faces he saw something he had been searching for since returning from France. People who had found a way to live according to their principles without compromise. "Because you've shown me something I thought didn't exist anymore," Tank said slowly. "You've proven that it's possible to choose your own path and stick to it, even when the whole world tells you it's impossible. That's worth protecting." Margaret studied Tank with the intensity of someone making a decision that would affect not just her own family, but the entire network of hidden Cherokee families represented on her map. "Tobias Morrison," she said finally, "you speak of protection, but what you're really offering is partnership. You're suggesting that we combine your legal advantages with our knowledge and commitment to create something stronger than either could achieve alone." "That's exactly what I'm suggesting." Catherine was still analyzing the proposal with military precision. "It would work only if we could trust each other completely. Any betrayal would be catastrophic for our entire community." Elizabeth had been studying Tank's face while her sister spoke, and now she added her own observation. "Trust is something that must be earned over time, not granted based on good intentions." Sarah had been quiet during this exchange, but now she stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out into the darkness as if seeking guidance from the mountain itself. "There's something else we haven't discussed," she said, without turning back to face the group. "The surveys aren't just about land use. There have been incidents at other locations. Cherokee families who resisted eviction have faced violence." Tank felt his combat instincts stirring, recognizing the implications of Sarah's words. "What kind of violence?" Margaret's expression grew darker. "The kind that's designed to send a message. Houses burned, livestock killed, family members beaten. The kind of violence that says resistance will not be tolerated. And you think that kind of pressure might eventually reach here?" Catherine nodded grimly. "We've been preparing for that possibility. This mountain has advantages for defense, but four women can only do so much against organized intimidation." Tank understood now why his appearance at their mountain had been so carefully evaluated. He wasn't just offering legal protection. He was offering his physical capabilities as a deterrent against violence. "I've seen that kind of intimidation before," Tank said quietly, "in the war and in the civilian world since I returned. Men who use violence to get what they want usually back down when they realize their targets can fight back effectively. Sarah turned back to face the group, her decision apparently made. Then perhaps it's time we stopped being invisible and started being visible in a way that demands respect rather than inviting exploitation. The evening had transformed from a simple meal into a strategy session that would determine the future of not just the Walker sisters, but potentially the entire network of hidden Cherokee families. Tank realized that his journey to check on 4 isolated women had become something far more significant. A chance to join a resistance movement that had been operating in secret for over a century. As the fire burned lower and the mountain night grew deeper, the 5 people around the stone circle began planning a transformation that would challenge everything the outside world thought it knew about this remote corner of North Carolina. The morning sun filtered through the pine canopy with a crystalline clarity that made everything in the sisters' clearing seem sharp and defined, as if the world had been redrawn overnight with more precise lines. Tank woke on a bed of pine boughs that the sisters had prepared for him near the main cabin, and for the first time in years, he felt the peculiar sensation of waking up somewhere that might actually become home. The sisters were already moving through their morning routines with the efficient grace that Tank was beginning to recognize as their signature characteristic. Margaret was tending a fire in an outdoor cooking area. Elizabeth was checking on medicinal plants that were drying in carefully constructed racks. Catherine was performing what looked like a security patrol of the clearing's perimeter, and Sarah was returning from the forest with fresh game that would supplement their breakfast. But there was something different about their movements this morning. A tension that suggested the previous night's conversation had fundamentally altered the atmosphere of their mountain sanctuary. These women were no longer simply maintaining their traditional lifestyle. They were preparing for war. "Good morning, Tobias Morrison," Margaret called out as Tank rose from his improvised bed. "I trust you slept well despite the hardness of our mountain accommodations." Tank stretched muscles that had grown accustomed to the logging camp's rough bunks, finding that the pine boughs had actually provided surprisingly comfortable rest. "Better than I've slept in months, actually. There's something about this place that feels peaceful." Sarah approached from the forest, carrying 2 rabbits that had been cleanly killed with her bow. "Peaceful for now," she said with a grimness that hadn't been present in her voice the previous evening. "But that may be about to change." Catherine completed her circuit of the clearing and rejoined the group, her expression confirming Tank's suspicion that something had shifted during the night. "We've had visitors," she announced without preamble. Tank felt his combat instincts immediately engage. "What kind of visitors?" Elizabeth looked up from her plant drying racks, her herb-stained fingers now gripping what Tank noticed was a skinning knife. The kind that leave marks on trees and scratches in the dirt to let people know they've been observed. Margaret gestured for Tank to join the sisters around the outdoor fire, where she was preparing what smelled like corn cakes mixed with wild berries. "During the night, someone scouted our clearing. They were careful, but not careful enough to avoid leaving sign that Catherine would notice." Tank studied the faces around the fire, seeing the kind of alert readiness that he recognized from his military experience. These women had shifted overnight from peaceful homesteaders to a defensive unit, preparing for potential conflict. "How do you know they were scouts rather than just hunters or travelers?" Tank asked. Catherine's smile was sharp as a blade. "Because hunters and travelers don't spend 3 hours observing the clearing from multiple vantage points. And they don't take careful note of defensive positions and escape routes." Sarah set down her game and began the practiced motions of field dressing. But Tank noticed that she positioned herself with clear sight lines to all approaches to the clearing. "The question is whether they were government surveyors getting a closer look at what they'll be claiming, or whether they were something more immediately dangerous." Tank felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling onto his shoulders. The sensation that had driven him to intervene in conflicts throughout his time in North Carolina. Either way, you're not facing this alone anymore. Margaret studied Tank's face with the intensity of someone making final evaluations about trust and commitment. That's a generous offer, Tobias Morrison, but you should understand what you're volunteering for. This isn't going to be a simple matter of filing paperwork and establishing legal residence. Elizabeth added her own warning. The people who want this land aren't going to be discouraged by the presence of one white man, even one of your impressive size. They have resources, legal authority, and a willingness to use violence when other methods fail. Tank had been considering exactly these issues during the hours before dawn, weighing his desire to help against the realistic assessment of what such help might cost. I understand the risks, but I also understand something about fighting when you're outnumbered and outgunned. Sometimes the key isn't having superior force. It's making the cost of victory too high for your enemies to accept. Catherine's expression showed the first genuine approval Tank had seen from her. You do think like a soldier. But this isn't a battlefield where the rules of engagement are clear. This is a situation where our enemies have the law on their side. Sarah finished with her game preparation and moved to help Margaret with the morning meal, but Tank could see that her attention remained focused on their conversation. Which is why we need to change the rules of engagement entirely. Tank looked around the circle of faces, seeing intelligence, determination, and the kind of quiet courage that he had learned to respect above all other qualities. What do you have in mind? It was Margaret who answered, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been planning this moment for longer than Tank realized. We're going to make ourselves visible in a way that forces the outside world to acknowledge our existence and our rights, but we're going to do it on our terms rather than theirs. Elizabeth elaborated. Instead of hiding from the surveys and hoping they pass us by, we're going to present ourselves as the legal and traditional caretakers of this land, with documentation that establishes our historical claim. Tank was intrigued, but puzzled. I thought you said you had no legal documentation. Catherine's smile was enigmatic. We said we had no official government documentation. We didn't say we had no documentation at all. Sarah disappeared into the cabin and returned with a wooden chest that looked old, enough to predate the Civil War. She set it down carefully beside the fire and opened it to reveal contents that made Tank's breath catch. Inside the chest were dozens of documents, some written on paper that had yellowed with age, others inscribed on materials that Tank didn't immediately recognize. There were what looked like land surveys drawn on deerskin, plant specimens that had been carefully preserved, and photographs that appeared to show the clearing in various stages of development over many decades. Our grandmother may have chosen to be invisible to the government, Margaret explained as she began laying out selected documents, but she was not invisible to her own people. Every improvement to this land, every seasonal cycle, every important event has been documented according to Cherokee tradition. Elizabeth picked up what Tank realized was a detailed botanical survey written in both English and Cherokee syllabary. We have scientific documentation of the medicinal plants we've cultivated, the environmental improvements we've made, and the wildlife populations we've maintained. This represents decades of careful environmental stewardship. Catherine showed Tank a series of photographs that chronicled the clearing's development from what appeared to be virgin forest to the sophisticated homestead it had become. These photographs span 40 years of continuous habitation and improvement. They establish our presence here long before any government surveys were even contemplated. Tank was amazed by the thoroughness of the documentation, but he was also concerned about its legal value. This is incredible work, but will it have any standing in court if this dispute ends up in the legal system? Sarah's laugh carried a note of anticipation that was almost fierce. That depends on how we present it and who we present it to. Margaret began repacking the documents with careful reverence. Tobias Morrison, what do you know about newspaper reporters and their interest in human interest stories? Tank felt a glimmer of understanding about the direction the sisters' planning was taking. I know they're always looking for stories that will capture public attention, especially stories about underdogs fighting against powerful interests. Elizabeth nodded approvingly. And what could be more compelling than the story of 4 Cherokee sisters who have maintained their traditional way of life for generations, only to face eviction by government bureaucrats who want to sell their ancestral land to mining companies? Catherine's strategic mind was clearly engaged with the possibilities. Public sympathy can be as powerful as legal documentation, especially when it's combined with evidence of historical injustice and environmental stewardship. Tank was beginning to see the brilliance of their approach. You're going to use publicity as a weapon against bureaucratic indifference. Sarah's expression was sharp with determination. We're going to make it politically impossible for the Veil government to remove us without looking like they're destroying something precious and irreplaceable. Margaret stood and began serving the morning meal, but Tank could see that her mind was focused on implementation details. The key is timing and presentation. We need to emerge from invisibility at exactly the right moment, with exactly the right story, supported by exactly the right evidence. Tank accepted his portion of the meal, struck by the incongruity of planning a media campaign while eating traditional Cherokee breakfast around a campfire in the wilderness. What do you need from me in this plan? Elizabeth's answer was immediate. We need you to be our bridge to the white world. A 7-foot war veteran who chose to protect Cherokee land rights is a story that newspaper reporters will find irresistible. Catherine added her own perspective. More importantly, we need you to be our deterrent against violence while we're implementing this plan. The period between emergence and legal resolution will be our most vulnerable time. Tank understood that. The sisters were asking him to be more than just a legal shield. They wanted him to be their protector during a process that would inevitably draw hostile attention from powerful interests. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice carrying a note of urgency that suggested new information. The scouts who observed our clearing last night weren't the only visitors we've had recently. Margaret set down her food and gave Sarah her full attention. What else? Sarah reached into her hunting pouch and withdrew a piece of paper that looked like it had been hastily written. I found this tied to a tree about half a mile down the mountain. It's a message from the Crowfeather family. Tank remembered Thomas Crowfeather from the logging camp, one of the Cherokee workers who had spoken about the Walker sisters during their evening conversations. Catherine took the message and read it quickly, her expression growing darker with each line. The government surveys have accelerated. 3 more families received eviction notices this week, and there have been 2 more incidents of violence against Cherokee families who refused to leave immediately. Elizabeth's hands clenched into fists around her eating utensils. How bad were the incidents? Sarah's voice was grim. Bad enough that the Crowfeather family is asking whether we want to coordinate our emergence with theirs. They're suggesting that multiple families revealing themselves simultaneously might provide better protection than isolated individual actions. Tank felt the familiar surge of protective anger that had driven so many of his interventions in the felt the familiar feminine of his protective anger that had driven so many of his interventions in the valley below. They're trying to intimidate people into compliance by making resistance seem hopeless. Margaret nodded slowly. Which is exactly why our plan needs to work. If we can establish a precedent for successful resistance, it will encourage other families to stand up for their rights. Catherine was studying the message with her strategic mind engaged. But coordination also means complexity, and complexity creates opportunities for failure. Tank realized that the sisters were facing a decision that would affect not just their own family, but the entire network of hidden Cherokee families throughout the mountains. The weight of that responsibility was evident in their expressions. How long do we have before we need to make a decision about coordination? Tank asked. Sarah consulted the message again. The Crow Feather family suggests a meeting in 3 days at a location they consider secure. They want to discuss unified strategy before any family takes independent action. Elizabeth looked around the circle of faces. Which means we have 3 days to finalize our own plan and decide whether we're willing to risk it as part of a larger effort. Tank understood that the next 3 days would determine not just the fate of the Walker sisters, but potentially the future of Cherokee resistance throughout western North Carolina. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. Then we'd better get to work, Tank said, standing and looking around the clearing that might soon become the center of a storm that would reshape the entire region. The sisters rose as well, and Tank could see in their movements the transformation from peaceful homesteaders to determined resistance fighters. Whatever came next, these 4 small Cherokee women had decided to step into the light and demand recognition of their right to exist. And Tank Morrison, the 7-foot giant who had spent years running from his own strength, had found something worth standing and fighting for. The 3 days that followed the arrival of the Crow Feather message transformed Tank's understanding of what it meant to be small in a world that measured worth by size and power. While his 7-foot frame had always made him the largest presence in any room, the Walker sisters began teaching him that true strength had nothing to do with physical stature and everything to do with the depth of one's connection to something larger than oneself. Margaret started his education on the second morning by leading him to a section of the homestead he had barely noticed during his initial tour. Hidden among a grove of ancient oaks was what she called the Memory Garden, a circular clearing where 4 generations of Cherokee women had planted, tended, and harvested according to traditions that predated European arrival in North America by centuries. This is where you begin to understand what we're really fighting for, Margaret said as she knelt beside plants that Tank was beginning to recognize as far more than simple vegetables. Every seed in this garden carries the genetic memory of our people. These plants have been selected, saved, and replanted by Cherokee women for hundreds of years. Tank watched as Margaret's weathered hands moved among leaves and stems, with the kind of intimate knowledge that spoke of lifelong relationship. You're not just growing food, you're preserving something that exists nowhere else. Exactly. Margaret stood and brushed soil from her hands, gesturing toward plants that Tank was now seeing with entirely new eyes. These varieties of corn, beans, and squash cannot be found in any commercial catalog. They represent centuries of careful cultivation designed to thrive in these specific mountain conditions. Elizabeth emerged from the forest carrying a basket filled with plants that Tank had learned to recognize as components of traditional medicines. Show him the heritage tobacco, Margaret. He needs to understand the spiritual dimension of what we're protecting. Margaret led Tank to a small, carefully tended plot where plants unlike any tobacco he had ever seen were growing in soil that appeared to have been enriched with generations of careful composting. This tobacco is not for recreational use. It is for ceremony, for prayer, for maintaining connection with the Creator and with the spirits of our ancestors. Tank studied the plants, beginning to grasp that the sisters' homestead was not simply a residence, but a living repository of Cherokee culture that had been maintained in its original form for over a century. If you're forced to leave this place, all of this knowledge dies with your displacement. Not just dies, Sarah called from across the garden, where she was checking snares that Tank had not even noticed during his previous explorations of the area. It's murdered, deliberately destroyed by people who see Cherokee culture as an obstacle to their own profit. Catherine appeared from the direction of the cabin, carrying what Tank initially thought was a hunting rifle, but which he now recognized as something far more sophisticated. The weapon was clearly handmade, crafted with the kind of precision that spoke of master-level gunsmithing skills. "Where did you get that?" Tank asked, impressed despite himself by the obvious quality of the craftsmanship. Catherine's smile carried a note of pride that Tank had not seen from her before. "I made it. Our grandfather taught our father, our father taught us. Cherokee men were known throughout the mountains for their gunsmithing skills, but Cherokee women had to learn those skills too when the men were forced to leave. Tank was beginning to understand that every aspect of the sisters' lives represented preservation of knowledge and skills that the outside world assumed had been lost or abandoned. You're not just living traditionally. You're living as completely Cherokee as it's possible to live in the modern world. Elizabeth set down her gathering basket and joined the conversation, which is precisely why we represent such a threat to people who want Cherokee culture to exist only in museums and tourist attractions. We prove that traditional ways can not only survive, but thrive when they're allowed to develop naturally. Margaret nodded toward the memory garden with its impossible varieties of heritage plants. We represent the possibility that Cherokee people don't have to choose between cultural authenticity and economic survival. That's a dangerous idea to people whose power depends on forcing such choices. Over the following hours, Tank received what amounted to a crash course in Cherokee philosophy, environmental science, and survival skills that redefined his understanding of education entirely. Sarah taught him to read the forest with the kind of detailed observation that revealed the health of entire ecosystems through subtle signs that he had been walking past all his life without noticing. Elizabeth showed him how to identify, gather, and process medicinal plants with techniques that produced remedies more effective than anything he had encountered in military or civilian medical care. Cherokee medicine doesn't just treat symptoms, she explained as she demonstrated the preparation of a tincture that would ease the joint pain Tank had been carrying since his war injuries. It addresses the whole person and their relationship to their environment. Catherine's lessons focused on defensive strategies that combined traditional Cherokee tactics with innovations adapted to modern threats. Tank watched in amazement as she demonstrated how the sisters had prepared their homestead for siege conditions without compromising its appearance as a peaceful residence. Hidden water storage, concealed food caches, defensive positions that look like gardening features. Catherine explained as she showed Tank modifications that had been so skillfully integrated into the landscape that they were invisible unless specifically pointed out. We've been preparing for this confrontation for years, but it was Margaret's evening lessons that affected Tank most profoundly. As they sat around the fire after their day of practical education, she began sharing Cherokee stories that carried teachings about the relationship between strength and wisdom, size and significance, power and responsibility. There is a Cherokee teaching about the rabbit and the bear, Margaret said as the fire settled into the glowing coals that provided perfect light for storytelling. The bear is proud of his size and strength, believing that these qualities make him the most important creature in the forest. But when winter comes and food becomes scarce, it is the rabbit's knowledge of hidden stores and secret paths that keeps the forest community alive. Tank listened with the attention he had learned to give to Cherokee wisdom, understanding that these stories contained practical guidance disguised as entertainment. The bear learns that true strength lies not in the ability to dominate others, but in the willingness to use one's gifts in service of the community's survival. When the bear stops trying to be the biggest and strongest, he becomes the most valuable member of the forest family. Sarah looked across the fire at Tank with eyes that seemed to reflect the ancient wisdom her sister was sharing. The question, for any person of unusual size or strength, is whether they will use their gifts to intimidate others or to protect what cannot protect itself. Tank felt the weight of that question in ways that went beyond the immediate situation with the walker. Sisters, I've spent years trying to figure out how to be useful without being frightening. But maybe I've been approaching the problem backwards. Elizabeth leaned forward, her expression encouraging Tank to continue his thought. How so? Maybe instead of trying to hide my size or apologize for my strength, I should be asking how to use these things in service of something worth protecting. Tank gestured toward the homestead around them, its buildings and gardens representing generations of careful cultivation. You've shown me something worth fighting for, something that would be irreplaceable if it were lost." Catherine's approval was evident in her voice. "Now you're beginning to understand why we were willing to trust you with our secrets. You're not looking for a fight, you're looking for a purpose." Margaret nodded slowly. "And purpose transforms everything about a person, including how they understand their own strength." The conversation was interrupted by a sound that brought all 5 people to immediate alertness. Someone was approaching through the forest, moving with the kind of careful stealth that suggested either hostile intent or extreme caution about their reception. Catherine was on her feet instantly, her handmade rifle in her hands and her eyes scanning the darkness beyond the firelight. Sarah had moved to a position that gave her clear shooting lanes with her bow. Elizabeth and Margaret had shifted to places that provided cover while maintaining their ability to respond to whatever emerged from the forest. Tank found himself moving with instincts honed by military combat, positioning himself between the potential threat and the sisters while remaining ready to respond to whatever emerged from the darkness. The figure that stepped into the firelight was a Cherokee man in his 40s, wearing the kind of practical clothing that marked him as someone who spent his life working outdoors. Tank recognized him immediately as Thomas Crowfeather from the logging camp. "Thomas," Margaret said, her voice carrying relief but maintaining wariness, "you're a day early for our meeting." Thomas approached the fire with the careful movements of someone who understood he was entering a defensive position. "Circumstances have changed, Margaret. We couldn't wait for the scheduled meeting." Catherine maintained her ready position with the rifle. "What kind of circumstances?" Thomas accepted Margaret's gesture to join them around the fire, but Tank could see tension in every line of his body. The government surveyors aren't just mapping the land anymore. They're accompanied by men who are clearly not government employees. Men with weapons and attitudes that suggest they're prepared to use violence to clear Cherokee families from disputed territory. Sarah's grip tightened on her bow. "How many men, and what kind of weapons?" "At least a dozen, possibly more. They're carrying military-style rifles, and they're moving through Cherokee territories with the kind of systematic approach that suggests they're following a predetermined plan to eliminate resistance." Tank felt his combat instincts fully engaging, recognizing the tactical situation that Thomas was describing. They're not just surveying. They're conducting reconnaissance for a military-style operation. Elizabeth's voice carried the controlled anger that Tank was learning to associate with Cherokee responses to systematic oppression. "Which means our timeline for resistance has just accelerated dramatically." Margaret studied Thomas's face in the firelight, reading information that went beyond his spoken words. "How much time do we have?" Thomas's answer sent a chill through the entire group. "Based on their current rate of movement and the territories they've already covered, I estimate they'll reach this area within the next 48 hours. Catherine's strategic mind was immediately engaged with defensive calculations. 2 days to implement a plan. We thought we had a week to prepare." Tank looked around the fire at faces that showed determination rather than fear, understanding now why the Cherokee had managed to maintain their cultural identity despite centuries of systematic attempts at elimination. "Then we'd better stop planning and start acting," Tank said, standing to his full 7-foot height and feeling, for the first time in years, that his size was exactly what the situation required. The education was over. The test was about to begin. The dawn that broke over the Walker Sisters Mountain carried with it the weight of impossible decisions and the bitter taste of betrayal. Tank woke not to the peaceful sounds of the forest he had grown to love, but to urgent whispers and the metallic clicking of weapons being prepared for combat. The sisters had been awake for hours, and Thomas Crowfeather sat by a fire that had been built for concealment rather than warmth, his face bearing news that would shatter any remaining illusions about peaceful resolution. "Tell him," Margaret said quietly as Tank joined the circle around the carefully shielded flames. Her voice carried the kind of controlled fury that Tank had learned to respect above all other emotions. Thomas looked up at Tank with eyes that held the haunted expression of someone who had witnessed atrocities. During the night, the armed men accompanying the government surveyors hit the Redbird family's homestead in the valley east of here. The family had lived there for 3 generations, never bothering anyone, contributing to the local community, raising their children to be respectful citizens. Tank felt ice forming in his stomach as he recognized the tone that preceded reports of violence against civilians. What happened to them? Sarah's voice was sharp as broken glass. What happened is that 12 armed white men surrounded a cabin containing an elderly Cherokee couple and their teenage granddaughter. When the family refused to sign papers renouncing any claim to their land, the men decided to provide encouragement. Tank closed his eyes, knowing what was coming but hoping he was wrong. Elizabeth continued the report with the clinical precision of someone who had learned to deliver terrible news without breaking down. They killed the livestock first, shooting the family's milk cow and chickens while the family watched from inside their cabin. Then they burned the outbuildings, including the smokehouse that contained the family's winter food supply. Catherine's hands were steady as she cleaned her rifle, but Tank could see the rage simmering beneath her controlled exterior. When the grandfather finally came outside to try to negotiate, they beat him unconscious with rifle butts. The grandmother tried to protect him and received similar treatment. Tank opened his eyes, seeing in the sisters' faces a transformation that went beyond simple anger. These women had shifted into something that reminded him of his most effective combat units. People who had accepted that violence was inevitable and who were preparing to meet it with everything they possessed. The granddaughter? Tank asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Thomas's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. She escaped into the forest while the men were focused on her grandparents. She ran through the night to bring word to other Cherokee families. That's how we learned what we're really facing. Margaret stood and began pacing around the fire with movements that suggested barely contained energy. This wasn't random violence or loss of control. This was a systematic demonstration designed to terrorize Cherokee families into compliance. Tank absorbed this information with the part of his mind that had been trained to assess tactical situations under extreme stress. They're using terror as a weapon to avoid having to remove families one by one. Much more efficient than legal proceedings. Sarah's laugh was bitter as winter wind. Efficient, yes. Also completely illegal and morally indefensible. But who's going to prosecute white men for crimes against Cherokee families that don't officially exist? The question hung in the morning air like smoke from the concealed fire, highlighting the impossible position the hidden Cherokee families found themselves in. Their very invisibility, which had protected them for generations, now made them vulnerable to violence that would never be investigated or punished. Elizabeth set down the medicinal supply she had been organizing and looked directly at Tank. This changes everything, Tobias Morrison. We're no longer talking about legal challenges or media campaigns. We're talking about defending our lives against people who have already demonstrated their willingness to use deadly force. Tank stood to his full height, feeling the familiar weight of command responsibility settling onto his shoulders. Then we defend. But we do it smart, and we do it in a way that creates consequences for the people who think Cherokee lives don't matter. Catherine paused in her weapon maintenance and studied Tank's face with the intensity of someone evaluating a potential battlefield commander. What are you thinking? Tank had been thinking about tactical problems from the moment Thomas finished his report, but he had also been thinking about something Margaret had taught him during their evening conversations. The difference between fighting to win and fighting to transform. I'm thinking that we have advantages these men don't expect us to have. They're used to intimidating isolated families who have no support and no way to fight back effectively. They're not prepared for organized resistance from people who know this terrain and who have been planning for exactly this kind of confrontation. Margaret stopped pacing and focused her attention on Tank's developing plan. What kind of organized resistance? Tank gestured toward the clearing around them, seeing it now through the eyes of a military strategist rather than an impressed visitor. This homestead isn't just a residence. It's a fortress that's been disguised as a peaceful family farm. Catherine has spent years preparing defensive positions, supply caches, and escape routes. But more importantly, you have something these men can't match. Sarah raised an eyebrow, which is, you belong here. This mountain is part of you in ways that go beyond simple familiarity. You know every tree, every stream, every animal path. You can move through this terrain like ghosts while they stumble around like the invaders they are. Thomas leaned forward, his expression showing the first hope Tank had seen since his arrival. You're talking about guerrilla warfare, Tank nodded slowly. I'm talking about using their aggression against them. They want to use fear as a weapon? We show them what real fear looks like when you're hunting armed men on terrain they don't understand. Elizabeth was studying Tank with new appreciation. But you're also talking about escalating this beyond anything Cherokee families have attempted in living memory. Once we start fighting back with organized violence, there's no returning to invisibility. Tank understood the magnitude of what he was suggesting, but he also understood something else that his military experience had taught him. Sometimes the only way to avoid total destruction was to make destruction too costly for your enemies to accept. The time for invisibility is over anyway, Tank said quietly. After what happened to the Redbird family, every Cherokee homestead in these mountains is going to be targeted. The choice isn't between violence and peace. The choice is between organized resistance and systematic elimination. Catherine set down her rifle and stood, moving to a position where she could see Tank's face clearly in the firelight. You're asking us to trust you to lead a military campaign against superior numbers and firepower. Tank met her gaze steadily. I'm asking you to trust me to help you fight for your survival using every advantage we can create. But I'm not asking you to follow me blindly. Cherokee families have been making life and death decisions without outside help for over a century. I'm offering to add my skills to your knowledge, not to replace your judgment with mine. Margaret resumed her pacing, but Tank could see that. Her movements now suggested planning rather than simply burning off nervous energy. What would organized resistance look like, practically speaking? Tank had been developing tactical scenarios since Thomas finished his report, drawing on both his military training and his growing understanding of Cherokee capabilities. It starts with intelligence gathering. We need to know exactly how many men we're facing, what kind of weapons they're carrying, and how they're planning to approach Cherokee homesteads. Sarah's expression brightened with something that looked like anticipation. I can scout their movements without being detected. These mountains have Cherokee paths that white men don't even know exist. Tank nodded approvingly. Intelligence gives us the ability to choose when and where to engage them. Instead of waiting for them to attack us, we make contact on our terms, in places where we have every advantage. Thomas was beginning to understand the scope of what Tank was proposing. You're talking about turning the entire mountain region into a battlefield where Cherokee families have tactical superiority. Tank's smile was grim but determined. I'm talking about making it so expensive for them to continue their terror campaign that they decide Cherokee families aren't worth the cost. Elizabeth raised a concern that Tank had been expecting. But what about Cherokee families who don't want to fight? What about children and elderly people who can't participate in guerrilla warfare? Catherine answered before Tank could respond. That's why we need to coordinate with other families like the Crow Feathers. Some families fight, others provide support. Still others evacuate to secure locations until the situation is resolved. Margaret stopped pacing and looked around the circle of faces with the expression of someone making a decision that would affect generations. This isn't just about surviving the next few days. This is about whether Cherokee families will continue to exist in these mountains at all. Tank understood that the sisters were weighing not just immediate tactical considerations, but the long-term implications of choosing organized resistance over continued hiding. Whatever you decide, you won't face it alone. But the decision has to be yours. Sarah stood and walked to the edge of the firelight, looking out into the forest that had been her family's sanctuary for generations. There's something else we need to consider. If we fight back successfully, if we actually manage to defeat these men, what happens next? Tank had been thinking about exactly that question. If we win, we create a precedent that Cherokee resistance is possible and effective. Other communities will be inspired to stand up for their own rights. Catherine's strategic mind was already working through longer-term scenarios. And if we lose? Tank's answer was honest but not hopeless. If we lose fighting, we lose his people, who refuse to be eliminated quietly. That's different from losing through passive acceptance of destruction. Elizabeth was gathering her medicinal supplies with movements that suggested she had reached her own decision. I've been thinking about what my grandmother would do in this situation. She chose to hide because hiding was the strategy that offered the best chance of survival for her family. But survival strategies have to change when circumstances change. Margaret returned to the fire and sat down with the deliberate movements of someone who had weighed all possibilities and reached a conclusion. My grandmother preserved our family and our culture by choosing invisibility. But preserving that gift for our grandchildren means choosing visibility now, regardless of the risks. Tank felt something shift in the atmosphere around the fire. A transformation from planning to commitment that he recognized from his most effective military units. Then we fight. Sarah turned back from her contemplation of the forest, her bow in her hands, and her expression carrying the kind of calm determination that Tank had learned to associate with Cherokee courage. Yes, we fight. But we fight as Cherokee women, using Cherokee wisdom for Cherokee survival. Thomas stood as well, his decision apparently made during the sisters' deliberation. The Crow Feather family and our allies will coordinate with whatever plan you develop. It's time to stop being invisible and start being dangerous. As the sun climbed higher over the Walker Sisters mountain, 5 people around a concealed fire began planning a resistance campaign that would either save Cherokee families from systematic elimination or provide them with a death that honored their ancestors' courage. For Tank Morrison, the 7-foot giant who had spent years running from his own strength, the moment marked a final transformation from someone seeking purpose to someone who had found something worth any sacrifice necessary. To protect it, the education was complete. The test was about to begin. And for the first time in his life, Tank understood what it truly meant to be strong. The mist that clung to the Walker Sisters mountain on the morning of the confrontation seemed thicker than usual, as if the ancient Cherokee spirits were providing cover for the battle that was about to reshape the balance of power in western North Carolina. Tank crouched behind a fallen oak log that Catherine had positioned months earlier as part of her defensive preparations, his 7-foot frame somehow rendered invisible by Cherokee camouflage techniques that Sarah had taught him during their 2 days of intensive preparation. The plan they had developed was elegantly simple in concept, but devastatingly complex in execution. Instead of waiting for the armed surveyors to reach the Walker homestead, they would intercept the group at a location chosen entirely for its tactical advantages. Sarah had spent the previous day shadowing the surveyors' movement, confirming that they were indeed following the systematic pattern Thomas had predicted, 12 armed men moving through Cherokee territories with the methodical efficiency of an extermination campaign. But what the surveyors didn't know was that their intended victims had been watching, planning, and preparing for exactly this confrontation. Cherokee families throughout the mountain region had spent the night implementing coordination plans that had been decades in the making. Some families evacuated to secure locations, others prepared defensive positions, and still others moved into support roles, that would ensure the resistance fighters had everything they needed for sustained operations. Tank checked his position one more time, confirming that he could see the approaches Sarah had identified as most likely for the surveyor's advance. The morning sun was beginning to burn through the mist, revealing a natural amphitheater, surrounded by rocks and fallen trees that would funnel any approaching group into a confined space where Cherokee defenders would have overwhelming advantages. Silence was broken by a sound that Tank had learned to recognize as Sarah's signal, the call of a wood thrush that was perfectly natural except for a subtle variation in rhythm that indicated the enemy was approaching. Tank felt his combat instincts fully engage, his breathing slowing and his awareness expanding to include every sound, movement, and potential threat in his environment. Through the dissipating mist, Tank began to make out shapes moving along the game trail that led toward the Walker homestead. 12 men, as Sarah had reported, carrying military-style rifles and moving with the kind of aggressive confidence that suggested they expected no meaningful resistance from their intended victims. The lead man was tall and lean, with the bearing of someone accustomed to command and the kind of cold eyes that Tank associated with people who had made peace with inflicting violence on others. Behind him came 11 followers who looked like they had been recruited specifically for intimidation work, large, heavily armed, and displaying the kind of casual cruelty that made civilian populations easy to terrorize. Tank watched them approach the carefully chosen killing ground, noting their formation, their weapons handling, and their complete lack of awareness that they were walking into a trap prepared by people who understood this terrain with generational intimacy. They moved like conquerors entering territory they already owned, certain that any resistance they encountered would be easily crushed. The leader raised his hand, bringing the group to a halt at exactly the location Catherine had predicted they would choose for final reconnaissance before approaching the Walker homestead. Tank could hear voices carrying through the morning air, though he couldn't make out individual words from his concealed position. Then Sarah's second signal came, the cry of a red-tailed hawk that meant the enemy had committed to the killing. Ground and all defenders should prepare for coordinated action. Tank felt the familiar calm that preceded combat, his mind automatically cataloging targets, distances, and tactical opportunities. The first shot came not from Tank's position, but from Catherine's carefully chosen location, 50 yards to his left. The crack of her handmade rifle was followed immediately by the leader's cry of pain as her bullet found its mark in his shoulder, spinning him around and sending him crashing into 2 of his followers. What followed was chaos, but chaos carefully orchestrated by Cherokee planning and executed with the precision that came from intimate knowledge of every rock, tree, and hiding place in the natural amphitheater. Elizabeth's position commanded the trail's exit, preventing retreat. Sarah's elevated location allowed her to rain arrows down on anyone who tried to take cover in the open areas. Margaret had positioned herself with clear shooting lanes that covered the spaces between the other defenders' fields of fire. Tank's role was different from the others and more dangerous. Instead of maintaining defensive position, his job was to emerge from concealment and use his size in combat, training to break the surveyor's ability to organize effective return fire. When Margaret's shot confirmed that all defenders were engaged, Tank rose from behind his fallen log and stepped into the open like an ancient Cherokee war chief materializing from the forest itself, the sight of a 7-foot giant appearing suddenly in their midst had exactly the psychological effect Tank had hoped for. 3 of the surveyors immediately broke and ran, abandoning their weapons and their wounded leader in their panic to escape what they assumed was some kind of supernatural manifestation. 2 others froze completely, their rifles forgotten as they stared at Tank with the kind of terror that made rational thought impossible. But the remaining 6 were made of sterner stuff, and Tank found himself under concentrated fire from men who understood that their survival depended on eliminating this unexpected threat. Bullets whined past his head and shattered bark from trees around him as Tank moved with the kind of controlled aggression that his military training had made instinctive. The key to Tank's tactics was using the terrain that the sisters had taught him to read like a familiar book. Instead of advancing in a straight line toward his enemies, he moved through the amphitheater using cover that was invisible to men who saw only rocks and trees rather than a landscape that had been shaped by Cherokee hands for defensive purposes. Catherine's rifle spoke again, and another surveyor went down with a lead wound that would prevent his escape but wouldn't kill him. Elizabeth emerged from her position long enough to deliver aimed fire that forced two more surveyors to abandon their advanced positions and fall back toward increasingly poor cover. Tank reached the first group of surveyors while they were still trying to process the impossibility of their situation. A pregnant woman, an elderly Cherokee woman, and two other small figures had somehow transformed into deadly opponents who were systematically destroying their overwhelming advantage in numbers and firepower. The hand-to-hand fighting that followed was brutal but brief. Tank's size and combat training, combined with the psychological shock of facing organized Cherokee resistance, made the outcome inevitable. Within minutes, 6 armed men who had arrived expecting to terrorize helpless civilians found themselves disarmed, wounded, and completely at the mercy of people they had planned to eliminate. The leader, bleeding from Catherine's shoulder wound, but still conscious, looked up at Tank with a mixture of pain and bewilderment. "Who the hell are you? People?" This was supposed to be empty land with maybe a few scattered families hiding in the woods. Tank knelt beside the wounded man, his voice carrying the kind of quiet authority that made argument impossible. "We're the people who live here. We're the people you made the mistake of thinking were helpless." Sarah appeared at Tank's side, having descended from her elevated position with the silent grace that Tank had learned to associate with Cherokee movement through forest terrain. "More importantly," she said, looking down at the wounded leader with eyes that held no sympathy, "we're the people who are going to make sure everyone knows what you and your friends have been doing to Cherokee families." Elizabeth emerged from the forest carrying a medical kit that Tank recognized as containing traditional Cherokee remedies alongside modern supplies. "We're going to treat your wounds," she told the injured surveyors, "because that's what civilized people do. But then you're going to answer some questions about who sent you and why they thought terrorizing Cherokee families was acceptable." Catherine appeared with rope that would be used to secure the prisoners, her strategic mind already engaged with the larger implications of their successful ambush. "This was just the advance team. There will be others, and they'll be better prepared once word gets back about what happened here." Margaret was the last to emerge from her defensive position, carrying herself with the dignity of someone who had just proven that Cherokee resistance was not only possible but devastatingly effective. "Which is why this victory is only the beginning, not the end of our struggle." Tank looked around the natural amphitheater that had been transformed from a peaceful forest clearing into a battlefield where Cherokee families had announced their refusal to be eliminated quietly. The wounded surveyors were being treated with the kind of medical care their victims would never have received, demonstrating the fundamental difference between Cherokee values and the casual cruelty they had been fighting against. "What happens to them now?" Tank asked, gesturing toward the prisoners who were beginning to understand that their capture was going to have consequences that extended far beyond their immediate situation. Thomas Crow Feather emerged from the forest where he had been coordinating communications with other Cherokee families throughout the mountain region. "Now they become witnesses," he said with satisfaction. "Witnesses to the fact that Cherokee families are not helpless victims waiting to be eliminated." Sarah was already examining documents that had been taken from the surveyor's leader, her expression growing darker as she read. "These orders are signed by officials from the Bureau of Indian Affairs, but they're also endorsed by private mining companies and timber interests. This isn't just government harassment. This is a coordinated effort by business interests to clear Cherokee families from land they want to exploit. Tank felt his anger building as he understood the scope of what they were fighting against. They're using government authority to do private companies' dirty work. Elizabeth nodded grimly. Which means our resistance needs to be more than just self-defense. We need to expose the conspiracy and make it politically impossible for them to continue. Catherine was studying the captured weapons and equipment with the appraising eye of someone cataloging resources for future operations. We also need to prepare for escalation. Once they realize that their terror campaign has been met with organized resistance, they'll respond with greater force. Margaret walked among the prisoners with the bearing of someone who had just reclaimed authority that had been stolen from her people for generations. Let them escalate. Cherokee families have been preparing for this confrontation for over a century. Today we prove that we're ready for whatever they choose to bring against us. Tank stood to his full height, looking around at 4 Cherokee women who had just demonstrated that size and strength had nothing to do with the ability to defend what mattered most. He had come to their mountain as a giant seeking purpose, but he had learned that true power came from being part of something larger than oneself. The battle was won, but Tank understood that the war for Cherokee survival was just beginning. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he belonged and what he was fighting for. The mountain had fought back, and it had won. But the victory belonged not to Tank's size and strength, but to the Cherokee wisdom that had taught him when giants become small enough to serve something greater than themselves. 6 months after the battle in the Natural Amphitheater, Tank Morrison stood before a congressional hearing in Washington, D.C., his 7-foot frame dwarfed not by the imposing marble architecture of the Capitol building, but by the magnitude of what 4 small Cherokee women had accomplished through their refusal to remain invisible. The hearing room was packed with reporters, government officials, and representatives from Cherokee communities throughout the southeastern United States. But Tank's attention was focused on the 4 women seated at the witness table beside him: Margaret, Elizabeth, Catherine, and Sarah Walker, no longer hidden guardians of a mountain sanctuary, but recognized leaders of a movement that had transformed the national conversation about indigenous rights and government accountability. The documents that Sarah had discovered during their ambush of the surveyor team had proven to be the key that unlocked a conspiracy involving multiple federal agencies, private mining corporations, and timber companies. The coordinated effort to eliminate Cherokee families from their ancestral lands was not just local harassment, but part of a systematic campaign to clear indigenous people from territories that contained valuable natural resources. But the exposure of the conspiracy had required more than just captured documents. It had required Cherokee families throughout the mountain regions to step forward and testify about decades of harassment, intimidation, and violence that had been ignored by authorities who preferred to believe that Cherokee communities no longer existed in significant numbers. Tank listened as Margaret testified about her family's century-long struggle to maintain their cultural identity while remaining invisible to a government that would have destroyed their way of life if it had officially acknowledged their existence. Her voice carried the authority of someone who had survived everything the modern world could throw at traditional peoples and had emerged stronger rather than broken. For over 100 years, Margaret told the congressional panel, Cherokee families in the mountains of North Carolina have preserved not just our own survival, but irreplaceable knowledge about sustainable living, traditional medicine, and environmental stewardship that benefits all Americans, not just Cherokee people. Elizabeth followed with testimony about the heritage plants and traditional medicines that would have been lost forever if Cherokee families had been successfully eliminated from their mountain homesteads. She brought samples of varieties of corn, beans, and medicinal plants that existed nowhere else in the world, demonstrating the scientific value of what private companies had been trying to destroy for profit. Catherine's testimony focused on the military-style organization of the violence directed against Cherokee families, presenting evidence that the Bureau of Indian Affairs had essentially contracted with private security companies to conduct what amounted to ethnic cleansing operations disguised as routine administrative actions. But it was Sarah's testimony that captured national attention and transformed public understanding of what had been happening in the remote mountains of western North Carolina. She spoke with quiet dignity about the choice Cherokee families had faced: abandon their cultural identity to gain legal protection, or maintain their traditional ways while accepting that they could be eliminated at any time without legal recourse. "We chose to fight," Sarah said, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room, "not because we wanted violence, but because we wanted our grandchildren to have the same choice our grandmothers had, the right to be Cherokee in the land where Cherokee people belong." Tank's own testimony focused on what he had witnessed during his time with the Walker sisters and the broader Cherokee community. As a white military veteran, his words carried weight with congressional representatives who might have dismissed Cherokee voices as biased or exaggerated. "These families are not asking for special treatment," Tank told the panel. "They're asking for the same rights that any other American families would expect. The right to live peacefully on land they've improved and maintained for generations. The right to be protected from violence rather than being targeted by it. And the right to preserve their cultural heritage without being forced to choose between tradition and survival." The congressional hearing was the culmination of months of careful political strategy that had been developed through the same kind of collaborative planning that had made the mountain ambush successful. Cherokee families throughout the region had coordinated their emergence from invisibility, presenting themselves simultaneously to media outlets, legal advocates, and political representatives in a campaign that made denial or suppression impossible. The captured surveyors had become unwilling allies in exposing the conspiracy, their testimony revealing the scope of the private interests behind the government's actions. Faced with federal charges for their violent actions against Cherokee families, several of them had accepted plea bargains that required full cooperation with the congressional investigation. Tank watched as Congressman James Whitfield, the panel's chairman, reviewed the evidence that had been presented over 3 days of hearings. Whitfield was a veteran himself, and Tank could see recognition in his eyes as he processed the implications of what had been revealed. "Mr. Morrison," Congressman Whitfield said, addressing Tank directly, "you've described a situation where American citizens were being systematically terrorized and potentially eliminated by their own government acting on behalf of private business interests. As a veteran, how do you reconcile this with the oath you took to defend the Constitution?" Tank had been preparing for this question since the hearings began, understanding that his answer would help determine whether the congressional investigation resulted in meaningful reform or simply political theater. "Sir, I took an oath to defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic. When I saw what was happening to Cherokee families in North Carolina, I recognized domestic enemies of constitutional principles, people who were using government authority to deny American citizens their basic rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." Tank paused, looking at the 4 sisters who had taught him the difference between strength and power, between size and significance. "The Cherokee families I met weren't asking their government to give them anything. They were asking their government to stop trying to take away what they had built with their own hands over generations of hard work. When I understood that, my choice became clear. I could either honor my oath by protecting American citizens from domestic enemies, or I could abandon my oath by allowing the systematic destruction of people who embodied the best values this country claims to represent." Congressman Whitfield nodded slowly, his expression suggesting that Tank's words had resonated with something deeper than political calculation. "And what would you recommend this committee do in response to what we've learned?" Margaret leaned forward, understanding that this was the moment when months of struggle would either result in meaningful change or bureaucratic Delay designed to outlast public attention. Congressman Whitfield, she said, Cherokee families don't need the government to solve our problems for us. We've been solving our own problems for over a century. What we need is legal recognition of our right to continue doing so without interference from people who see our success as an obstacle to their profit. Elizabeth added her own perspective. We need protection for the traditional knowledge we've preserved, the heritage plants we've maintained, and the sustainable practices we've developed. This knowledge benefits all Americans, but it can only be preserved by people who have the cultural context to maintain it properly. Catherine's request was more specific. We need investigation and prosecution of the officials who authorized violence against Cherokee families, and we need guarantees that such authorization will never be given again. Sarah's demand was the most comprehensive. We need formal recognition that Cherokee families who choose traditional lifestyles have the same rights as any other American families, including the right to legal protection, the right to maintain our cultural practices, and the right to be consulted before any government actions that might affect our communities. Congressman Whitfield looked around the hearing room, taking in the faces of Cherokee families who had traveled from throughout the region to witness this moment, and the reporters who would carry word of the proceedings to a national audience that was beginning to understand the implications of what had been revealed. This committee will recommend immediate suspension of all surveying activities in Cherokee territories pending a full investigation of the conspiracy we've uncovered, Whitfield announced. We will also recommend federal legislation that provides explicit protection for traditional indigenous communities and establishes legal frameworks for preventing the kind of abuse we've documented. The hearing room erupted in applause, but Tank noticed that the Walker sisters received the announcement with the kind of quiet satisfaction that suggested they had expected nothing less. These women had spent months preparing not just for victory, but for the responsibilities that victory would bring. As the formal hearings concluded and the crowds began to disperse, Tank found himself standing with the four sisters on the steps of the Capitol building, looking out over a city that represented the power structures they had just successfully challenged. So what happens now? Tank asked, understanding that the congressional victory was a beginning rather than an ending. Margaret smiled with the expression of someone who had spent her entire life preparing for this moment. Now we go home and continue being Cherokee. But we do it with legal protection instead of in hiding. And we do it knowing that other Cherokee families will have the same choices we've had. Elizabeth was already thinking about practical implications. We'll need to establish formal relationships with universities and research institutions that want to study traditional Cherokee knowledge, but we'll do it as partners, not as subjects. Catherine's strategic mind was engaged with longer-term possibilities. We'll also need to help other indigenous communities that are facing similar challenges. The legal precedents we've established can be used to protect traditional peoples throughout the country. Sarah was looking toward the future with the kind of anticipation that Tank had learned to associate with Cherokee confidence in their ability to adapt and thrive. And we'll need to teach Cherokee children that they don't have to choose between being Cherokee and being successful in the modern world. They can be both. Tank realized that his role in the Cherokee struggle was evolving from protector to partner, from someone who used his size to intimidate enemies to someone who used his legal status to open doors for people who had been excluded from power structures they deserved to influence. What about the homestead? Tank asked. Are you going back to the mountain? Margaret's answer reflected the wisdom that had guided Cherokee survival for generations. The mountain is our home, but it was never our prison. We stayed there because it was the safest place to preserve what mattered most to us. Now that we have legal protection, we can choose where to live based on what's best for our families and our community, not just what's safest. As they walked down the Capitol steps together, Tank reflected on the journey that had brought a 7-foot giant and 4 small Cherokee women from a hidden mountain homestead to the center of American political power. The transformation had then complete. He had learned that true strength came not from intimidating others, but from empowering them to achieve what they couldn't accomplish alone. 6 months earlier, Tank Morrison had been a wandering veteran looking for a place where his size and strength could be useful without being threatening. The Walker sisters had taught him that the answer wasn't finding the right place, but finding the right purpose, using whatever advantages he possessed in service of something larger than himself. The Cherokee families returning to their mountain homes carried with them legal protections that would ensure their grandchildren could make the same choices their grandmothers had made, to be Cherokee, to live Cherokee, and to preserve Cherokee wisdom for future generations who would face challenges not yet imagined. And Tank Morrison, the giant who had learned to bow to something greater than himself, returned with them to a mountain where he had discovered that being small in the service of justice was infinitely more satisfying than being large in the service of nothing at all. The story that had begun with fear and intimidation ended with respect and partnership, proving that sometimes the most powerful transformations happen not when giants learn to use their strength, but when they learn when not to use it. In the end, 4 tiny Cherokee sisters had indeed made the 7-foot giant feel small. But in teaching him to be small, they had shown him how to be truly strong. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.